Welcome back to the Innovation Room. We're excited to have you here. This is episode number 4. We made it to 4, so that's something to say. We're still enjoying it, still loving it. Can't wait to bring more episodes at you.
Yeah.
This episode is, business trends and what to look out for in 2021. We have a lot of, past, present, and future kind of stuff going on here. We have big things that were happening in 2019, some of the highest economic growth the country's ever seen. And then we have 2020 that...
Pause.
Yeah.
It stopped. March 2020 hit and COVID hit and we stopped. A lot of companies kept going, which is great. And, we want to dive into, but, a lot of people had to stop. And now the big question is what is to come in 2021? Are people going to continue to kind of sit and wait to see what happens, 2 steps forward, 1 step back situation? I think we're still in it a little bit, but What's to come in 2021? When do we get back to 2019?
Exactly, and that's a big question. So what should you look out for, and what should be on your radar 2021?
So the first thing that we're going to talk about are mergers and acquisitions. Back in 2019, there was a lot going on. Like we said, economic growth through the roof. But what those really are, what they mean, what we're looking at past, present, future, and what to expect. A merger and an acquisition, it's basically the same thing whether or not a brand name's changing. It's taking 1 and 1 plus 1, and making it 1.
Yeah.
You're taking 2 companies and smashing it together and making 1 company.
Yeah.
Whether or not you're keeping that culture, that same, business model is all in the fine print. But, we have those. What were we looking at back in 2019, though, when it was coming to these mergers and acquisitions? I feel like that they were really striving.
Yeah. So 2019 mergers and acquisitions were huge. They've, been on the up most overall since like 2005 for the most part, and some of the main reasons people, like the idea of a merger and acquisition rather than starting maybe a whole new brand or trying to break into another market with their existing brand and building new stores is, your technology and your data that you're acquiring from this other company. When you buy another brand, you're acquiring, their patents, you're acquiring all that kind of stuff that is only allowed to be used by said brand until maybe, some timeline is up, like with any patent. And the data is a huge thing. Data right now, I believe at one point was said to be worth more than the price of gold. Like information is worth more than gold. I don't know if you know this. We've kind of measured all currency based on the value of gold since the beginning of currency. So that's kind of a big deal. Right. But the other reasons to do so are for market share, obviously. If you don't have a large presence in a market that you'd like to be a part of, you can acquire another company, come in there, rebrand, and now take over part of that market share, or the overall market share for your brand is going to increase in general.
Right. So there's, in mind, what I've seen in the past is there's 2 different types of acquisitions or mergers. There's the horizontal, which is brand within brand. It's selling the same thing, same business model type, clothing, whatever it may be, retail, grocery, buying grocery, similar business clientele. But there's also the vertical market, and the vertical market is 2 other people buying that aren't really aligned. It's not ice cream selling ice cream. It's a cone selling company buying the ice cream business. I feel like we didn't see as much of that as we see as much as the horizontal, the like for like. Does that sound right?
Yeah, and I think that's a good point too as well, because the horizontal like for like also will allow 2 smaller brands to gain a competitive advantage in the market. We saw a good example of this just recently with T-Mobile and Sprint being the number 3 and 4 in the mobile industry against Verizon and AT&T, kind of taking that 1 and 2 spot back and forth. By them aligning and combining, there's now 3 players essentially in the brand with pretty equal market share, so they can compete on a better level, where T-Mobile and Sprint probably both realized, hey, we're competing, but more against each other and not really against who we want to be.
2 small fish trying to compete with the big fish at that point in time.
Yeah, and a lot of these horizontals, I believe, they're mostly for that reason, is that competitive advantage or that market share.
Yeah.
And sometimes just getting that technology and data helps you get that competitive advantage or that market share as well.
Right. Now, that kind of acquisition, that took place, I feel like that took place in 2020, but I'm sure it had been in the works in 2019 because there's a lot of prep that goes into coming to a point where you're going to do a merger and acquisition.
Yeah. Well, as vendors and, many of the other vendors who watch know, that's information we would always love to have is when did they start talking about this acquisition?
Yeah.
How do I get this intent data? Like, what are they intending to do? What are they going to do moving forward so we can be first in there?
Yeah.
But once it usually happens, they release a little more of that information. And I think that actually probably started around the end of 2019 is when those discussions happened from what I could gather.
Yeah. So at least in 2020, this is still happening. I mean, we're talking about that merger acquisition that's still happening in 2020 when people may be scared of that financial risk that comes along with a merger acquisition, which has got to be huge. I mean, that's got to be number one. And making sure the company's aligned is also another one. So you have the financial risk. You have the financial risks involved. And in 2019, it wasn't that big of a deal. I mean, it's still number one on your mind, but in 2020 now, the financial risk is a completely different ballgame. When people are setting on their money, even companies that are doing really, really well, it's kind of, I don't want to say hoarding money, but there's the 2 step forward, 1 step back that we've been talking about, being very, very cautious about what they're going to spend.
Like forecasting isn't really where it was, especially in 2019. The ability to forecast and see what's coming up in 2021 and 2022, this whole year has really muddled that down and made it very difficult for people to accurately do. We're seeing companies that were big companies skyrocket to the top. Companies like Salesforce, like a digital platform with the CRM or Zoom. Zoom was. People didn't even know what Zoom was. I think most people use Skype still, maybe, before this all happened. I'm not 100% sure. I didn't really FaceTime much.
Yeah.
But skyrocket all the way to the top.
Yep.
You can't forecast accurately like we were able to in 2019, so people are weary to invest, but they are still doing it, and they're ready to start doing it again as soon as they feel comfortable with that forecasting in 2021.
Yeah, so you got to make sure it's the right strategic fit. And there's the financial risk, there's a culture risk, there's the managing risk, and then you have timelines that you have to worry about. A lot of these things stay very quiet for a long time. Like you had said, we would love to know when the T-Mobile Sprint thing happened or when it started to happen, because these things do take a lot of time. There's a lot of things involved, not just financially, but asset-wise and management and employees. And I mean, you name it, there are so many levels to this. And I think a lot of what we're seeing right now are people pausing work, like we were talking about, but closings too. And that's the big scary thing on everybody's mind is there's closings happening, but how many of these companies are going to go through an acquisition or merger instead of that?
True.
I see a lot of industry specific things that worry me right now, and that would be like the non-essentials. So the non-essentials, the movie theaters that all shut down. You've heard rumors about that. Is the cinema going to be able to pick back up, and are they going to be able to pick back up where they left off? Are people going to go back to these non-essential companies and put themselves at risk during COVID and further expose themselves when they know that they can do the majority of the stuff online or they can stream on demand? It's what to expect for 2021. Where does the future go?
So a couple things or indicators that 2021 is going to be looking well is we have a link below here for an article that the experts are talking about 2021 and relating it to 2008 and 2009 in a way as the merger and acquisition industry is considered, at least, where they rebounded quite well in 2009. We went through a similar dip like this. People were very weary to invest. The ones that had money to invest were still kind of holding on to it. Any kind of economic downturn is going to do that to a business. But they bounced back very well in 2009. And using that as really the only information or the most relevant and recent information we have to go off of, I feel confident that the same will happen in 2021. Also, typical things that we've seen with any kind of disaster or something that's unfortunate that happens to a large community or a large sector of a business, there's always opportunities to be had. even with some of these businesses going out, there's a lot of acquiring opportunities to be had for the businesses that are staying afloat, whether it be acquiring for technology, for market share, for just space, whatever that is.
Yeah.
So 2021, I think there's a lot of opportunity, and I think that it will be going well. So we kind of want to get into more like, what have you seen on your end, regarding the signage and branding industry with mergers and acquisitions? Because we have a couple pretty large clients that we do these for often, and we've become pretty good at getting these done.
Yeah, no, we do. And you talked about a big one that happened just recently, which was T-Mobile Sprint. We don't necessarily do business with them, but we do with other companies. I've seen storage, regular storage companies, cold storage companies, and some other, that are still doing acquisitions and mergers. The thing that has really been daunting is when these companies are taking over. We've talked about the risk involved, but there's also that timeline. And I quickly hit on that a minute ago, but like industry specific wise, the timeline's huge.
Oh, so important.
There's so many things that are involved post acquisition that is just crazy. And now we deal with a lot of government things, permitting timelines. People want their brands changed quick, right? But we have a lot of things that we have to worry about from a signage perspective on the exterior stores that governments regulate. Now, these governments are working at half capacity, quarter capacity, maybe remotely, maybe full capacity. We don't really know. We don't have a good judgment on that, or judge on that, and handle on it. But you can tell things are taking more time, and you can tell that these mergers and acquisitions aren't happening as much because the people that are involved with that, they're really fine-tooth combing everything.
Yeah.
To where before we wouldn't have to worry about certificates of occupancy, C of Os, fire inspections, making sure old permits from the facility were up to date. A lot of the times that could be an oversight for a government because they're so overloaded and overworked that they fly right past it. Now, they're going through everything.
Yeah, they have extra time.
They do, and it directly impacts the signage permits. If they notice something's out of whack and something's currently in process, they'll put a freeze on it until they get everything else fixed. They can hold it hostage if you want to call it that. And so it's really important to be early. It's important, I think, for the companies that are involved with this stuff from a signage perspective and the actual merging companies to get them involved early.
Yeah.
That way they can get a handle on how long it's going to take, because the last thing you want to do is do a merger or acquisition and have the old company's name up there still for another 6 months to a year.
Yeah.
You don't want that to happen. And right now, the earlier you get us involved, the quicker we can get our groundwork running and moving to get that taken care of.
So it's more important now, I guess, than it would be before to work with vendors who have been in this situation, who have experience in it, who are experts in, mergers and acquisitions themselves, not so much rebranding. We've all rebranded a location as assigned people.
Right.
I'm sure any electrician or any HVAC guy has gone in and he's, rewired a building that's being changed over to something else, if somebody acquired a single, a new location, whatever that may be. But with the merger and acquisition, you got to understand this is large scale. This is, it could be 50 locations, but it could be 450 locations. They could be spread from the East Coast to the West Coast, or they could be all centralized in one hub, like in Texas. Right. So you really need to have a partner that is experienced and knows what they're doing and helping with this. Some of the largest reasons why. So a typical merger and acquisition, if it happens, you're expecting your return on investment to be seen at some point. Like this has all been calculated prior to going through the deals. There's always things that come up, like maybe a building's not to code or maybe a permit wasn't pulled the way it was supposed to be. Yeah. But you have an expectation of this, and half the reason this merger and acquisition may be beneficial to you, if it's not for a technological or data standpoint, is your return on investment is like a 12-month turn. So you're almost flipping, like someone who flips a house, but you're holding the asset for longer and you're using it for your advantage long term. Right. If you're not rebranding properly or going through these proper steps with someone who is able to get your timeline completed in the time it needs to be completed in, your 12-month ROI could turn into 24, 36, 48. And is it a good deal, or did you guys just, make a huge mistake with this merger and acquisition? Right. Because your plan wasn't where it needed to be.
Yeah, and it's everything, and that's what I was saying. I don't think it's just necessarily signage either. They need to get everybody involved early right now to get that moving, and I think that was important before, but now it's even more important given our current situation, world situation that we're in. Yep. So the earlier you get people involved, the better off you're going to be. There's no reason to keep a secret for too long, although I know that that's a huge risk of it too, is having an acquisition or a merger fall through just because something got leaked and, people get cold feet and say, hey, we're pulling back now.
So with NDAs, though, at least working with vendors and clients, I feel they could get those out a little earlier than they probably do. Okay. And that, could be one of our tips here moving to 2021. There are lots of opportunities. Maybe you look at getting those NDAs out quicker to your vendors. Make sure you have the right vendors in place so you're not, last minute trying to change a vendor. And I think that's going to help you moving forward and taking advantage of these opportunities and really positioning yourself well for 2021 once you believe your forecasting where it's at is where it's supposed to be at, and you feel comfortable with now making these moves. Do you have anything really on mergers and acquisitions that we should add additionally as maybe a tip or takeaway for anyone looking into this?
I think you nailed it. Early. Get people involved early. That pre-plan, make sure you got everything taken care of. I don't personally do mergers and acquisitions, but make sure you have everything taken care of.
Sure.
Make sure you check all the boxes. That way nothing gets held up.
Yeah, and we're not even talking like, prices or surveys of any of this stuff, because if the deal goes through, that's a lot of sunk costs. So we're not talking about that. We're just talking about get those partnerships in line,
Yep.
And I think that's probably the best piece of advice we can give moving into 2021.
Yep.